Recording in progress.
Okay. All right. Well, good morning. Happy Friday. Today is already July 17th. All right. So we're going to go right into one of the most complex and a lot of questions regarding the liquidated damages. And I get this quite often. I know and I understand the language. I understand how it works. And I wanted to provide you and just share, some understanding and knowledge. And with all the changes that have occurred through the California Association of Realtors and all of the changes with documentations, there's different segments where this liquidate damage provision comes into play. Now, most of us know that once you represent a buyer or a seller, you're going to see this language or verbiage come up, right? And that's typically through the residential purchase agreement under paragraph 29. Okay. So, what is liquidated damage provision? So, let's dive deep into it and really just have a concise conversation. So, first off, let me ask you, okay, and let me move this for a bit. $50,000, right, is the earnest deposit. Okay. Is the earnest deposit immediately, okay, get released to either the buyer or the seller?
No.
Okay. You submit an offer gets accepted. There's a $50,000 deposit, right? Does the deposit automatically get released to either party, right? If the buyer believes that it's their deposit, does it get released automatically or does it get released to the seller if they believe that it's the seller's money? Truth or false? What do you think? Okay, the answer is no, it's false. Okay, it doesn't automatically get released to either party, even if the buyer is within their contractual rights for the earnest deposit to be returned. It doesn't automatically get released to the buyer. There has to be what's called mutual consent. It has to be mutually agreed upon by all parties. And if there's a dispute regarding the deposit, then the money is stays put and it's instructed by the neutral company, which is our escrow company, to stand by, right? It doesn't get released to either party, right? So, surprisingly, people believe that the money should automatically be released once the buyer cancels, okay? Or vice versa, when the seller believes that the buyer breached the contract, that the seller should be receiving the deposit, but it doesn't work that way, okay? So again, it is false, right? Not necessarily. The answer depends on the breach deposit amount, property type, and proper initials. Okay. So there's a lot of elements and components before any of those will take in effect, right? All of which will be impact, in today's session, right? So understanding there has to be a breach. We have to know what amount it is. And then we have to also determine if it's an owner occupied or is it an investment, right? And then the most important one, has it been initialed on the purchase agreement? There's also a new form that I'm going to share with you that in case the buyer or the seller fail to sign the liquidated damage provision on the purchase agreement, they created a separate form. It's a one-page form that talks about liquidated damage and also it talks about arbitration, I believe. Okay. So understand that it's not an automatic thing. Damages versus liquidated damages, right? So ordinary contracts, damages, seller must provide a breach. Seller must prove actual harm. Seller must provide a dollar amount through court or what we call arbitration. Now, liquidated damages, which is the easy path, seller must still prove that the buyer breached the contract, right? The buyer didn't perform. We send a notice to perform, and the buyer failed to perform. Doesn't necessarily mean that the seller is entitled to the earnest deposit. But then it also depends on the circumstances, and that's the beauty about real estate transaction. The amount is also pre-arranged too. So there is no court fight over the number, right? Because we set the tone from the very beginning when an actual buyer submits an offer, right? They usually put in an earnest deposit amount, right? And it's between the seller and the buyer to determine, do they need to add additional deposit because maybe it's less than the amount that the seller is willing to take on opening escrow, or is it that they're adding even more of the initial deposit, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about it as we go through the presentation. So why do we even have this liquidated damage provision, right? Well, for most, it avoids a long, tiresome, painful litigation, right? No one wants to be in a lawsuit, right? Do you want to be in a lawsuit? No. Do you want to be in a lawsuit? We know we don't want to be in any type of lawsuit, right? So the essence, it gives us concise clearance that we understand that if there is a dispute, we have already a certain element in how we can dive into and ultimately try to diffuse, de-escalate the situation, or fight, right? Because maybe the seller disagrees with the buyer, maybe the buyer disagrees with the seller regarding the earnest deposit, right? And there's many variables and many situations and circumstances will dictate how the money is ultimately released to either party, because the seller may be entitled to the deposit because the buyer failed to perform in a certain thing, didn't close the deal, and ultimately released all of the contingencies, right? So you have to kind of weigh it out and see. Now, I always stress and I always say that if you don't know, please bring it to our attention so that way we can help you navigate it, right? Fairness. Both parties agree up front, right? So the beautiful thing is I submit an offer to the listing agent. The listing agent sends it over to the seller. They review it. They determine, they sign and execute the agreement. And now you have an agreement in place, right? And then through the escrow period, something happens, right? And now there's not a meeting of the mind, right? The goal is always to try to close the deal, right? At the end of the day, we try to close the deal. But if something goes haywire, goes sideways, then we already pre-existed all of this from the very beginning when we were in negotiations from the very beginning when we submitted an offer, right? We already know the price, terms, and conditions, including if the liquidated damage was signed and executed, and then what is the amount of deposit that the buyer put into escrow to determine where we're at. And last, it's an efficient process, right? It saves time and then legal costs, right? Because these cases can drag and drag, but ultimately, when you have it in black and white, it makes it a whole lot easier to just go back to the contract. This is what we agree. You're at fault. You're not at fault. We have a disagreement. You're in breach. Whatever the case may be, this is the reason you have instructions, right? And if you really think about it, when you look at the purchase agreement, it also has where it says about escrow instructions, right? So it coincides. It ultimately is a mirror of what the purchase agreement and the instructions that escrow has. It just mirrors the RPA, the residential purchase agreement. Okay. So the LD stands for liquidated damages, protects the seller from providing hard to quality losses like missed opportunities. Okay. So, and I'll explain it a little bit more as we go into this. So here it is, paragraph 29. This is the key language. Buyer fails to complete purchase because of buyer's default. Okay. Buyer fails to complete purchase because of buyer's default. So the default is very simple, right? Buyer simply refuses to close. Okay. Is that a good reason? Cancellation. Buyer exercises a contingency right. Well, yeah, if the buyer is within rights and have protected their contingencies, and then the buyer decides to back out because they just do not like the condition of the property after doing their inspections, they decide to send a cancellation. They have not released, physical inspections. Then the buyer's within their rights to exercise and cancel. But just to simply say, I refuse to close after the buyer has released all contingencies, and it may be many variables, right? Well, that is not a good reason. The seller can definitely go after the buyer's deposit. So only default can trigger the liquidated damage contingency exists. Contingencies exist, do not, right? So in essence, folks, this is why it's very, very important that when you are reviewing the purchase agreement, if you're on the seller side, make sure that the buyer does initial the liquidated damage sector or section in order to ultimately hold the buyer accountable if the buyer breaches the contract and decides to cancel. Okay, so kind of consider that and ultimately make sure you understand the element. So, any questions so far? All right, so with the LD applies, okay, so this is the liquidated damage. And when it doesn't apply, right? So here's kind of a glance of how it works, right? Buyer refuses to close, no contingency. Okay, buyer refuses to close, meaning something is preventing the seller from continuance because the buyer refuses to close, but there is no more contingencies because the buyer released all of the contingencies, physical, okay, appraisal, loan, seller disclosures. So yeah, under that provision, if the buyer refuses, and now the seller ultimately sends a demand to close, and the buyer fails to, yeah, the buyer would be responsible to initiate the release of the deposit to the seller because the buyer is in breach of the contract. Okay. Now, there's many variables that happen, but the black and white of it, if the buyer releases everything and decides to cancel, then the money typically would be going to the seller because the buyer breached the contract, right? And this is, again, you're at the last stage of escrow. You're 25, 26 days. Buyer has released all contingencies. Something happens that the buyer cannot perform. Buyer has to cancel, right? Sends the cancellation. Seller will determine if what section of the cancellation the buyer signed. Is the buyer releasing the deposit back to the buyer is releasing the deposit to the seller, or is there a dispute? Okay. And if there's a dispute, regardless, remember, even if the buyer released all contingencies, escrow still will not release the money to the seller. Well, Simon, wait a minute. You just told us that the buyer released all contingencies, sent out a cancellation, right? But the cancellation is vital and important because what does it say on the cancellation? Because if it says, yeah, we defaulted, we're releasing, it's our fault, we cannot perform, I'd rather move on, the money typically would go to the seller, right? But if there's a dispute and the buyer believes, in their opinion, that something that the buyer might have done that changed the trajectory of this, then the buyer may say, I disagree. I'm still canceling, but I'm not releasing the money. We have a dispute. And now escrow is instructed to kind of navigate this and wait. Their job is just to wait. They're not going to release until we have mutual agreement between both parties. If that means releasing the money to the seller, fantastic. If that means releasing the money to the buyer, fantastic. If that means that the buyer and the seller agree to a certain dollar amount, fantastic. It all depends on the principles involved in this transaction. Buyer cancels under loan contingency. Okay, so meaning that the buyer cannot get the loan and decides to cancel. They haven't released loan contingency, so no liquidated damage provision impacts the buyer in this case, right? Because one, they had the loan contingency still protected because they were uncertain if the loan was going to happen and get approved. And then they find out that from the lender, we're not going to be able to get approved. Something happened. we're not going to be able to get the funds necessary to close the deal. But I protected myself because I never released the loan contingency. In this case, then yeah, the buyer's within their time period to exercise the cancellation and get their full deposit back. Buyer cancels under investigation contingency, same component, same situation, right? Buyer goes, gets the offer accepted. Buyer goes into their due diligence and getting all of the inspections, right? And then the buyer says, oh my gosh, I was just talking to an agent literally this morning, same situation scenario. They're canceling because after doing all of the inspections, the buyer just felt overwhelmed because this house has a lot of issues, a lot of problems. It's going to cost too much money. And I know for a fact that the seller will not give us the credit, nor will fix it, or even a price reduction. I'd rather just play it safe and cancel. They're within their exercise of what we call contingency 14 or paragraph 14 to cancel. So under this situation and scenario, no, they do not lose or forfeit their deposit to the seller. Seller breaches. Okay, so let's say that the buyer releases all contingencies. We're in the home stretch, 30 days, and the seller's delaying the process, right? And we were supposed to cancel, right? We were supposed to cancel on the let's say the 25th, and now we're on the 27th, right? Well, before that, you have to arm yourself and position yourself. If it's the seller's fault for not closing on time when we had a scheduled day to close, then what you as a buyer's agent and the buyer can do is what's called a demand to close and force the seller to close. Maybe the seller's not signing the grantee. Maybe the seller didn't provide the escrow instructions back. Many situations, or the seller just refuses. Then we, as a buyer, can send a demand to close to the seller. And if the seller does not perform, then we can cancel, meaning us, the buyers, can cancel. And we, as a buyer, can also retain full deposit even after the buyer has released all contingency. Because remember, the seller is the one breaching the contract, not us. Okay? The seller is. So no to the liquidated damage provision. Seller cancels after issuing the NTP, the notice to perform. So we are going through our motions, 17 days, the listing agent sends us a notice to perform to release any and all. That gives us what? 48 hours, 2 days to perform. And we do not perform by the second day at 11:59 p.m., then the seller has every right to cancel. Now, because of that, the seller is not in the rights to get their buyer's deposit because we still protected ourselves with the contingency in place. Yes, we're basically in breach, yes, but we also have what's called that layer of protection. And that layer of protection is the contingencies in place. And if we don't release those contingencies, therefore, we're protected if we don't perform or we decide to cancel, right? In this case, the seller canceled on us because they sent us the notice to perform and we did not perform within that time period. The seller has the right to cancel, put the property back on the market, find another qualified buyer, and then the money should be returned back to the buyer. Now, again, I want to stress, and I want to also be clear on this, that it depends on the circumstances too. Because if the buyer requested the seller to do repairs, okay, and the seller did those repairs, termite fumigation, tenting, did some repairs, and now the seller ultimately was damaged, say $5,000, the seller has every right to say, look, I'm not going to cancel and release the money until we can come to an agreement. And that's perfectly fine. Well, Simon, wait a minute. You just said that if the buyer protects their contingencies, they have the right to get their full deposit. Yes, but also it depends on the circumstances, right? Now, I would never guide my seller to do any repairs until I know that the buyer has released all contingencies. because now I know that the buyer's deposit is exposed. And if the buyer cancels, then one, we have at least up to possibly 3% of the earnest deposit that now would typically be given to the seller. And if that $5,000 is what we put, well, we can take it from the buyer's deposit. Does that make sense? Okay. Buyer never deposit EMD. Okay. Buyer never deposits EMD. Now, there's specific language now that says that the buyer and the seller should consult, right? Or more so the seller to consult. What happens, right? If you open escrow and the buyer never put the earnest deposit, right? And you're going through the motions because the buyer and the buyer agent told you, yeah, we're gonna put the money, but never did, right? Now you're not gonna wait and drag it for days and days and days or weeks, right? You're gonna send immediately because the contract is very clear and concise that says this, that the buyer, after acceptance within 3 business days, will put in their earnest deposit in escrow. And if the buyer doesn't put the earnest deposit in escrow, the seller will send the buyer a notice to perform. That gives the buyer an additional 2 days to perform, right? To put that money in escrow. And if the buyer doesn't, then you immediately cancel, right? Because they never put the earnest deposit. Never, 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 never go into escrow. If you're the listing agent and represent the seller, go in with no deposit because the buyer has no skin in the game. And if there is an issue, damage, or breach, there's no money. And I'm going to explain how all of this works, right? Because it can be a situation where now the seller can come to us and try to sue us because we were not competent in our position and we didn't guide our clients to their best interest. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about Civil Code 1675 and then who qualifies, right? So under the code 1675, it says the following, that 1 to 4 unit buyer intends to occupy. There's what we call the 3% rule applies. Okay, investment properties, buyers are not occupying, then there is no 3% presumption. The standards are different. Okay, so when you look at the offer, is the offer owner occupied or is this an investment? Because that changes the trajectory of the conversation, but more so what happens to the earnest deposit and how it works. Always ask, right? Is this owner occupied or is this an investment, right? And for the most part, be diligent in your approach because we're going to explain the differences and how it works. So the 3% rule is in practice, right? So example 1, you're in an SFR, purchase price is $800,000. Buyer moves in and gives 3%, right? Which is a $24,000 earnest deposit. Okay, and that's based on, again, the 3% that ultimately says on the purchase agreement, right? Example number 2, investment is a duplex, purchase price is $800,000. Buyer is not occupying, no automatic 3% presumption, court may scrutinize. The 3% ceiling is a statutory protection for residential owner occupants, and I'll explain it. Okay, so scenario 1 is this, right? If you do the math, if you go 800,000 times 3%, that gives you $24,000. That should typically be in escrow. Okay. Now, the liquidated damage provision protects the buyer if it's owner occupied, right? But let's say that the 3%. And let me do a calculations real quick, so we're all on the same page. Let's say that the buyer puts in $30,000 earnest deposit because they want a strong presence. They want to show because there may be multiple offers, right? So the agent says, look, we're competing with a cash offer. I know you have 50,000, you have 30,000, even though, the max that the seller might go after is 3%. and you convince the buyer to
What's up, girl?
go in at additional, right? So the buyer breaches the contract, releases all contingencies, right? In this case, the buyer is an owner occupied, and the seller now believes that the entire $30,000 or $50,000 is theirs. Doesn't work that way. Okay. The way it works is very simple. The maximum amount that the seller can go after is the 3%. Okay, meaning that the most the seller can go is 24,000. The remainder would have to go back to the buyer. And again, this is only on a owner-occupant property. Now, when it comes to an investment property, that automatic assumption doesn't happen, right? Because in this case, if the buyer puts in additional or more than 3%, in this case, let's say they put 50,000, but it is not owner occupant, okay, then ultimately the seller may be able to go after the entire amount. Okay, that's the distinguishes. Now, I also will tell you that there is another document that needs to be filled out before that can happen. It's not just automatic. You have to include another form, and I'll explain it shortly. Okay, so do we understand the distinguishes between owner occupant or an investment where it's not owner occupant? Owner occupant, the most that the seller can go is up to 3%. Owner occupant protects, right? If the buyer puts in additional and ultimately defaults, the seller can only go up to 3%. Investments, that is subject to be determined, right? Depending on the situation and the circumstances. And if the proper documentation is in place, then yeah, the seller might be able to go even more than 3%.
Simon, can I jump in real quick?
Absolutely.
Yeah, you know, when you're representing buyers, truly having an understanding of this portion of the liquidated damages, having an understanding definitely can work to your and your buyer's advantage, especially if you're representing a buyer who is intending to own or occupy. I use this quite often when representing buyers in competing offers, saying, "Hey, just like you used your, 30,000 example, there's many times on an $800,000 property or $1 million property, instead of writing it for 30,000, their down payment was going to be 200. I say, let's go in to distinguish yourself from your competition. Let's write $100,000 deposit just for shock value, okay? Because it has no difference of the amount that you're going to forfeit if you were to breach, than if you were to put 24,000 on an $800,000 price. The biggest distinction that you have to make sure you pay attention to is making sure if the buyer is owner occupied or investor, because if you end up telling your investor, the maximum you can lose is 3%, and they end up writing a 10% deposit check, that whole 10%, as you state, can be at risk of loss. And then if they relied upon you saying, well, I only did it because you said the maximum I could lose is 3%, of which you said inaccurately, then you, the agent, could be then held liable for your buyer's loss. So making sure that you really pay attention who your client is.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Steve. Thank you. Yeah, good point. All right, the most misunderstood rule, right? So the deposit promise is 30,000. The deposit actually paid was only 5,000. The maximum liquidated damage seller can retain is only the 5,000. Even though the provision says that 3% is the amount that the seller can go after, right? But the buyer only put 5,000 and never put in the difference of 25,000. And the buyer breaches the contract, decides to cancel, releases all contingencies. The seller can now only go after the $5,000. They cannot come back and says, well, I know I can go up to 3%. That's 30,000. I'm going to sue the buyer for $30,000. Shame on the agent. Okay. who represented the seller, because if you had mentioned that from the very beginning in negotiations that the buyer in their counteroffer, they need to increase their earnest deposit up to 3%, then the buyer should have had that money in escrow. And if the buyer didn't, then you send the notice to perform and then cancel if the buyer doesn't put in the additional funds. In this case, the civil code uses the phrase actual made, okay, or actual paid in this case. That promise alone is not enough. So meaning that the seller cannot go after the buyer for additional funds when those funds were never in escrow, okay? What if the buyer never deposits anything into escrow, right? And that can happen. I just had a situation with one of the agents where the agent stipulates and says, well, the buyer wants to do their inspections before they put their earnest deposit in escrow. And I asked her, can you repeat the question again? Yeah, the buyer wants to do their physical inspections before they decide to put their earnest deposit. And I said, can you repeat the question again? I'm just kidding. But the situation did happen. I says, well, it doesn't work that way. Okay. Now, I don't know. I'm not the listing agent, but I would not allow something to happen like that. That's not the way the process works. Okay. Yes, we accepted your offer. And if you read the contract defines and clearly states that, you know, as soon as you have mutual acceptance, the buyer within a time period, please make sure you mute yourself. 1 second, guys. Mute. Now I lost my chain of thought. So in this case, if the buyer doesn't put the money in escrow, then I would say send the notice to perform when you need it. Now, if there's hesitation and you feel that sense from the buyer's agent, guess what? As soon as you get the offer accepted, remember, you can send a notice to perform 2 days prior to the date of when that expiration date is. So if you know that it's 3 days that the buyer has to put in the deposit, right? On the second day, right after the first day, the second day, you can now send a notice to perform. And on the date that the buyer should have that money in escrow, doesn't, well, then the seller has the right to cancel. Okay, that's being proactive instead of waiting the 3 days. And most agents wait because, you know, it's still early. They don't want to get the agent pissed off or the buyer pissed off. Well, you know what? It's a business. Okay, and I'm not going to tolerate anyone that is not abiding by the contracts. And if you're going to play that from the very beginning, you know, unfortunately, I have to protect my client's best interest. I'm going to send you the notice to perform because I'm not going to waste time with someone that's going to drag their feet. Are you in or are you out? Okay, because remember, once you get a buyer in escrow, it has to be mutually agreed to cancel. And if this buyer drags their feet, it may jeopardize your ability to ultimately sell it to someone else. So it's a catch-22. So you got to be very, very careful as well. Does that make sense? All right. So what if the buyer never deposits anything, right? So the possible of the liquidated damage clause still applies, right? Possible general damage may still apply. But the RPA under section 5A3, I believe, now instructs parties to consult an attorney when the buyer fails to make a deposit. The remedy depends on the specific facts, right? So it depends on the situation. Now, as I mentioned, myself or someone that's seasoned experience representing the seller will not allow a buyer to go in with no deposit or think that the buyer says to the buyer's agent says to the listing agent, listen, there's certain circumstances right now. The money is coming from out of area, out of the country. I've seen those, right? Where they don't have the money, but it's coming from an account. Well, or even like mutual funds or stocks and all that, right? They may not be liquid, right? But they need to pull the money, but that may take, 7, maybe 14 days, right? Well, those are tricky situations, right? Because if they're not liquid, why are they even bothering and making an offer? I would probably second judgment on this and tell the seller, look, it's a risk. I don't know if you want to take that risk or just wait until the buyer ultimately gets the money into their account. And then at that point in time, they can submit an offer and not accept this offer because now, regardless if the money is in or not, you're in a contract with this buyer, regardless if the deposit is in escrow or not, right? So in essence, you got to be very careful, and this is why it gets instructed that the seller should seek legal advice on how to approach that, right? Because what happens if you do accept and the buyer ultimately does their physical inspections, because they think everything is good, and something happens where they damage the property, okay? And there's still no deposit in escrow. And they damage the property and then they decide to cancel, right? What happens then? Well, there's no deposit for damages, right? So we can at least dispute something that is not even able to dispute because there's no earnest deposit to position yourself to try to navigate that and says, look, you damaged the property due to your contractor or your inspector that damaged the plumbing, right? Or forced. I had another situation where the hydro jetting, that cleans the sewer lines, damaged the sewer line, and I think it was like several $1,000s. But imagine if the buyer didn't have any earnest deposit in this situation and that was damage, and now the buyer says, you know what, that's going to be like a $12,000. I want out, right? So you got to look at the pros and cons on those situations, right? Now, obviously, the seller can then pursue a legal lawsuit against the buyer, but that's going to be outside the realms of the contract, right? You want to hold the position as a seller and a listing agent that the buyer should have some skin in the game. Otherwise, probably wait until the buyer gets the funds to wire the money. Because if they're saying, look, we want the property, but we're not going to get the money until 14 days from now, well, I would probably say, and I would advise, but it's at the end, the seller's discretion decision to wait until the buyer has the means to put into escrow. Otherwise, I would not accept the offer. That's just my opinion. But everyone has their different opinions on it. That's just my opinion. All right, so the new form, and this is the new form that was created a couple months back. Excuse me, what's the date? July. Sorry, last month in June. It's called the LDAA. Now, this form is basically a one-sheeter. Okay, one sheet that talks about the liquidated damage provision, and it also talks about arbitration. So why did CAR create it, right? Well, the old problem was that the original agreement signed on the purchase agreement, buyer adds additional later, right? So you submit an offer. You're negotiating with the listing agent and the seller. The listing agent failed to see that the liquidated damage was not initial by the buyer. You and the buyer's agent believe you have an acceptance. You submit that to escrow. Escrow doesn't see that either and ultimately opens escrow and you have an escrow number, right? And then you realize after the fact, holy moly, the buyer never initialed paragraph 29 on the purchase agreement. What do you do? Okay. Well, you can't go back to the RPA and have the buyer sign it anymore. So what now the solution is you create this new document. And that new document is the liquidated damage and arbitration addendum, CAR form LDAA. Okay. Allows parties to add the liquidated damage or arbitration after the fact when all require signatures. So in case the buyer or the seller failed to sign that, you can now use this form to add it as a supplement to the RPA. If even one party does not initial, that provision is excluded, basically. So be mindful, okay? If you're the listing agent, read through the purchase agreement and make sure that that you're seeing that all of the initials are in place. This is why it's important that you have a TC, right? A TC will help you navigate that for you as well. But if it's missing and you open escrow, don't worry. Immediately populate the ADAA form and have the buyer and the seller agree to sign that, right? Because that's going to protect all parties, right? It'll protect the buyer and it also protect the seller when it comes to the earnest deposit. So when to use it and when not to use it, right? So use the form when the liquidated damage initials were missed on the original RPA. Arbitration initials were omitted, meaning they were also not signed, or a counteroffer changed terms and initials were not reobtained. Okay. Do not use the form when both parties already properly initial. So if it's already on the purchase agreement signed and executed in initial, then there's no need for this form. It's already on the purchase agreement. Parties do not want to. Okay. So guess what? The buyer and the seller can agree not to have that section initial. Okay. Maybe the buyer doesn't, but the seller does. And if the buyer refuses, does that mean that the seller has to accept their offer? No. You're going to prepare a counteroffer asking the buyer to sign an initial paragraph 29. And if the buyer still refuses to sign paragraph 29, well, that's your indicator. That's your answer. You either take the risk or you don't take the risk. And guess what? A lot of attorneys that are slash buyers will probably not want to sign that. Okay. It's a discretion. It's a decision made by either party. I truly believe you should have it signed because it protects the integrity of the process. But you cannot force a buyer, you cannot force a seller to do so. Okay. So legal counsel advises against it, right? So attorneys typically don't want to sign it because it holds pretty strong in a dispute. So the additional deposit, the rule most agents miss, right? So let's say that the original deposit in the liquidated damage, it was initialed on the purchase agreement was $10,000, right? And then the buyer puts in an additional 40,000, but didn't sign the DID. Okay, the DID is a form. It's not did. Okay, it's an actual form. Yeah, I know it's a little confusing, but the form is called DID. Buyer defaults. Okay, meaning the buyer decides to cancel. Seller can only retain the $10,000, not the actual 50, because the DID was never signed. Under Civil Code 1678 requires a separate LD provision for each sequential payment intended to be part of the liquidated damage amount. Use the form DID. Okay, so if you know that the buyer is putting additional deposit because they want their offer to be a strong offer, remember the rule. It has to be it has to be non-owner occupant. Okay. And it's more of an investment. And the buyer wants a strong position and is willing to put $100,000, but you know that 3% is the total amount, right? On a owner occupied. Well, in this case, you can, because it may be a greater number, right? It may be a commercial transaction, right? It may be $5-6 million deal. 3% may not be enough, right? So in this case, then you're going to instruct the buyer to sign a DID, meaning that now the entire earnest deposit that is put in escrow may be. included as liquidated damages, but only if the did is executed and provided. Otherwise, no. Then the only amount that's in escrow per se. All right, we'll go through a quick scenarios, and you decide. One would be the loan contingency cancel, the EMD deposit, investment property default, the did, which again we kind of discuss.
Simon, can I jump in real quick on that did?
Sure.
To
Yes,
throw
sir.
in a something that I do, kind of a tip that since one of the things you will find when you are a listing agent, okay, and you end up countering, okay, one of the when you counter an increased deposit to get your deposit, to get the deposit up to 3%, again, if only within your counter offer, if it was $1 million sale, the buyer wrote it for a $15,000 deposit, 3% of $1 million is 30,000. So in the counter offer, you end up putting deposit shall be 30,000, which is the increase of 15. And the buyer does that. Buyer signs off all contingencies, defaults. Remember, the seller is only allowed the initial 15 because there was no Form DID signed. One of the things to ensure that Form DID is then signed, I then put it in my counter offer in addition to buyer to then submit a buyer's deposit to be 30,000 and buyer to sign Form DID within 2 days of depositing funds into escrow. And then you, as the listing agent, obviously double check to make sure if escrow then has received those additional funds or all the funds. And then if they did not, then you send out the notice to perform. But without that Form DID, and the number one thing is to then make sure you put it in the counter offer, because without that Form DID signed, right, that those additional funds are not part of it. And 9 times out of 10, you're going to get back from the buyer's agent, what's Form DID? Okay.
Yeah, no, good point. Appreciate it. Thank you, Steve.
Mm-hmm.
Quick scenarios. Okay, so scenario one, buyer cancels under the loan contingency. Seller wants the deposit. Okay, so can the seller go after the buyer's deposit if the buyer cancels, but is still protected under the loan contingency? Okay, how many people say no? How many people say yes? How many people say I don't know? Well, in this scenario, my opinion, it depends on the circumstances. Okay, just because the buyer still held on to the loan contingency and now they decide to cancel, right? We need to dig deeper into that conversation. Is it truly that the buyer cannot get the loan, or they just got cold feet and their mortgage and interest rate is something that they feel a little uncomfortable, but they still can get the loan? Think about the situation, right? Because now at this case, you're 17 days, you're maybe 3 weeks into this. It depends on the circumstances. So this is a maybe, in my opinion. Okay. So the LD contingency cancellation is not a breach. Deposit must be released to the buyer. Yes, to that certain extent. I get it. But it also depends on the situation. Now, if it is truly a loan issue where the buyer cannot get the loan, they got canceled, they cannot get, then yeah, they're within their rights. And the answer is yes. But I've seen circumstances, they use that as a decoy because now they get cold feet, right? And not comfortable with the payment. That is not a good reason also to cancel. Now you got to angle and position, because if you're dealing with a very savvy listing agent, they may dig deep into it, call the listing agent, ask for additional proof. And if the buyer, just because of the mortgage payment, even though they got approved, the seller might still be able to go after some of that deposit. Just giving you my perspective. Scenario number 2, buyer never deposits earnest deposit, seller cancel. Okay, so again, it's unclear. Consult with an attorney. Revenue depends on facts. the liquidated damage provision may or may not apply. Okay, so it's again, look under the RPA paragraph 5A3. All right, the next scenario, investment, right? Duplex, 50,000 deposit, buyer defaults, right? So no automatic 3% presumption. The LD may still apply, but court will scrutinize investment property plays a big difference in the rule. Scenario number 4, 10,000 original deposit, 15 additional deposit. There is no DID signed, buyer defaults. Maximum retention is 10,000. The 15,000 additional lacks a supportive LD provision, meaning that that money will ultimately go back to the buyer. Buyer deposits 30,000, purchase price is 600,000, owner occupy, then 3% equals 18,000. Seller can retain only 18,000, even though a 30,000 was deposit amount actually paid into, right? So again, just because there's more than the 3%, remember, if the buyer defaults, right, the maximum amount owner occupant is 3%. In this case, it would be 18,000 instead of 30,000. Seller cancels after notice to perform because contingencies were not removed. Again, seller breach or seller initiated cancellation eliminates the liquidated damage provision. Even if the buyer released all contingency, it's not the buyer's fault, it's the seller's fault that ultimately got us in this predicament. And just a couple of takeaways, right? What I call the 10 rules. Okay, so remember, the liquidated damage is never automatic. Buyer breach must exist. Contingency cancellation is not a breach. Seller breach eliminates the LD. Escrow never releases money automatically. Deposit must be actual paid. Owner-occupant rules differ from investments. The distinguishes between you moving into the property as a buyer, owner-occupant, or is this an investment? The additional deposit requires the DID. So any additional, only in an investment, not owner-occupant, will need a DID in order to go after additional money. Missing initials can avoid the clause. Make sure you add the LDAA. And then agents advise on the contract. Legal disputes belong to the attorneys. Okay. So let me, that is pretty much all with the presentation. But I wanted to show you the actual form. So this is the DID, which is delivery of increase. People on Zoom, can you see this?
No.
Okay, thank you. Let me make sure it's. Fred, you had a question?
Yes. After you're done with your thing, I have a question about arbitration of disputes initials. But go ahead, finish
Okay.
finish your previous slide. So I don't want to interrupt
Okay.
you.
Got it. Thank you. All right. So let me go ahead and stop and just move. Sorry about that. I have to do a little bit of moving around here. That way you can actually see the form itself. One second. Okay, where did it go? Sorry about that, guys. Not sure why it's not doing it anymore. People on Zoom, can you see the stream or no?
No,
No.
we cannot.
No.
We see you fine, but not
Okay.
not
The form we do
yeah,
not
the
see.
forms.
Okay. I'm not sure why I'm not seeing the actual Zoom. And I apologize because usually it's here. I know people in class could see it, but for some odd reason, let me